A silent window sees everything and forgets nothing. Welcome to Fog Casebook. I am your host, Vela. Drop a comment and share where you're tuning in from. I truly appreciate it. On with the story. It has ever been my practice, when the press of life permits, to set down in some orderly fashion those singular episodes in which I have been privileged to observe Mr. Sherlock Holmes at work. There are cases of his which the public may recall by reason of their theatrical conclusions, their dramatic villains, or the spectacular risks which attended them. Yet it has been my experience that the truest measure of Holmes's genius is more often to be found in those quieter affairs where a commonplace object, a button, a smear of clay, the fold of a letter, becomes, in his hands, the pivot upon which men's fortunes turn. When the adventure which I am about to relate, under the title of The Window That Watched Them All, belongs emphatically to this latter class. It began with no more than a polite card, and ended, if I may anticipate so far, with Scotland Yard, red-faced and bewildered, a gentleman of standing restored to honour, and Holmes, as was his manner, dismissing the whole matter with an airy indifference that was in itself as provoking as it was admirable. The fog and the violin. It was in the early part of November, when London wears that damp grey cloak which clings to the very soul, that I found myself once more installed in the old rooms at number 221 B. Baker Street. My own domestic circumstances, which need not concern the reader, had for a time carried me away from Holmes's immediate orbit, but a mutual friend and the quiet persuasion of Mrs. P. Hudson's maternal tyranny had contrived to bring me back to that familiar sitting-room where the coal fire crackled, the gas hissed, and the world's most remarkable brain alternated between astonishing lethargy and electric activity. Holmes was in one of his moods of concentrated introspection. He lay at full length upon the sofa, his long, nervous frame relaxed, his hands clasped behind his head, and his keen, aquiline profile thrown into sharp relief by the flickering firelight. From the litter of papers upon the table and the faint, acrid scent which suggested chemical experiments lately concluded, I inferred that he had been working. Yet his eyes were half closed, and his face bore that peculiar expression which I had learned to associate not with fatigue, but with the very opposite, a mind so alert that it withdrew from the trivialities of the visible world to range unhampered among the invisible threads which bind cause to effect. I had taken up the Daily Telegraph, more from habit than interest, when the long fingers of my companion suddenly twitched, and without opening his eyes he remarked, "You have been in the country within the last 48 hours, Watson." I laid down my paper, with an impatience which I took no pains to conceal. "My dear Holmes," said I, "if you are going to begin again with these tricks—" "They are not tricks," he answered quietly. "They are deductions." "And upon what," I demanded, "do you base that conclusion? And I have not mentioned any journey." Holmes opened his eyes at last, and regarded me with that half-amused, half-pitying look which was so exasperating to a man of ordinary faculties. "You have mud upon the instep of your left boot," said he. "Not the yellow clay of the Marylebone Road, nor the grey splash of Regent's Park, but the rich, red loam of the Surrey border. The particular sticky quality of it, clinging in a thin ridge, suggests the lanes near Esher after rain. Also, your sleeve bears a faint smear of greenish pollen, pine, I think, which is not encountered in any quantity within a mile of Baker Street. Lastly, your watch chain has a minute burr caught in it, such as one obtains by brushing against gorse." I laughed in spite of myself. "I did go down to see an old patient near Esher," I admitted. "But really, Holmes—" "Really," he interrupted, "you must not persist in believing that the universe is governed by magic. It is governed by laws. Once one has trained oneself to observe, the rest is merely a matter of reasoning. He stretched his arm to the mantelpiece, took up his violin, and drew the bow lightly across the strings. A thin, plaintive note rose and fell like a voice trying to speak through fog. It was at that moment, while the melancholy of the season and the music combined to produce in me a certain reflective mood, that there came a sharp knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson's step sounded upon the stair. A moment later she entered, wiping her hands upon her apron. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," said she. "He's in a terrible way, sir." "I'm shaking like a leaf." Holmes's eyes brightened, the small, quick spark which always came at the prospect of mental exertion. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson." Our visitor entered almost immediately. He was a man of perhaps 45, tall and spare, with the stoop of one accustomed to desks rather than exertion. His clothes were those of a prosperous professional, well-cut black coat, a waistcoat of dark satin, and boots which had been carefully polished. Yet there was an air of disorder about him, as though he had dressed in haste. His tie was slightly awry, his hair unbrushed in places, and his pale face bore the drawn look of one who has not slept. He stood for an instant upon the threshold, as if uncertain whether to advance or retreat. Then, catching Holmes's intent gaze, he stepped forward with a kind of desperate resolution. "Mr. or Sherlock Holmes?" he asked. Holmes inclined his head. "And you are?" "My name is Mr. Percival Hatherley," said he. "Of Gray's Inn. I am—" His voice faltered. He swallowed hard. "I am in urgent need of your assistance." "Pray take a seat, Mr. Hatherley," Holmes replied, indicating the armchair by the fire. "You appear to have been subjected to some agitation." The man sank into the chair, as one whose strength has been running upon empty. His hands, which he clasped together, trembled visibly. "I do not know where to begin," said he. "It is so absurd, so monstrous that if I had not lived it I should doubt my own senses." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his chin resting upon the tips of his fingers. "Begin at the beginning," said he, "or, if you prefer, begin at the point which most presses upon your mind. Watson, you will oblige me by taking notes." I drew my chair nearer and produced my pencil, for I had learned that when Holmes requested my attention in this way, the matter was one likely to repay it. Mr. Hatherley took a breath, as though steadying himself. "2 nights ago," said he, "I was in my chambers in Gray's Inn, working late over a brief. About 11:30 I heard footsteps in the passage outside, and then a knock. My clerk had gone, and I was not expecting any visitor. I called out, 'Come in,' and the door opened to admit a man whom I had never seen before. He paused, and his eyes flicked nervously to the window beside us, where the curtains stirred faintly in the draught. I noticed, as I watched him, that his gaze returned again and again to that dark square of glass, as though the very idea of windows had become intolerable. This man," he continued, "was well dressed, too well perhaps for the hour. He had a heavy overcoat, and he wore gloves. His face was partly hidden by the collar, but I remember his eyes, light eyes, cold and watchful. He asked for me by name, and said he had been referred to me by a mutual acquaintance." "Did he name this acquaintance?" asked Holmes. "He did. He said Mr. Aldridge, of Chancery Lane, had recommended me." Holmes' expression did not change, but I saw his eyebrows lift a fraction. "Aldridge," he murmured. "The conveyancer?" "Yes. I have had dealings with him. He is known to me, so I did not at once suspect anything. The stranger sat down and said he wished to consult me privately upon a matter of a delicate nature." "What was the nature?" Holmes's voice was gentle, but there was steel beneath it. Mr. Hatherley's hands tightened until the knuckles showed white. He spoke of a certain paper, said he, a document which, if it were to become public, might ruin a family of high position. He implied, without quite saying so, that it involved a lady. He wished to secure it, to obtain it from someone who threatened to use it for blackmail. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And he wished you to act for him? Yes. He said he had money, and he produced a purse heavy with sovereigns to prove it. But it was not the money that frightened me, Mr. Holmes. The man leaned forward, his voice sinking. It was the way he spoke. He did not speak as a client speaks to a lawyer. He spoke as a man giving orders to a subordinate. And you objected? I told him that if he wished me to act, I must know the names involved and see evidence of the matter. He smiled. Oh, Mr. Holmes, I can see that smile now. And he said that I should know enough in time. Then he asked me a question that has haunted me ever since. What question? He asked me whether the windows of my chambers looked upon the inn. I felt, even as I wrote the words, a faint chill. Your windows, Holmes repeated softly. What did you answer? I said yes, of course they do. My sitting room looks upon the courtyard. He rose then and walked to the window. He did not open the curtains, but he stood very close to them, as if listening. Hatherley shuddered. Then he said, Someone has been watching you, Mr. Hatherley? Holmes's fingers steepled. And did you believe him? I did not know what to think, but at that very moment, Hatherley cried, there came a sharp tap upon the pane. I stopped writing. Holmes did not move, and yet there was an instant in which the room seemed to tighten, as if the air itself had drawn a breath. A tap? Holmes asked. Yes, not upon the door, upon the glass. 3 quick taps like the knuckles of a hand. But we are on the 2nd floor, Mr. Holmes. The courtyard below is empty at that hour, and even if a man stood there, he could not reach the pane. Holmes' eyes flashed. What did you do? I sprang to the window and pulled back the curtain. There was nothing at all. Only the fog thick in the courtyard, and the lamps like dim moons. But I swear to you, Mr. Holmes, I saw for an instant, only an instant, a shape pressed close to the outside of the glass. A face, pale as paper, and an eye that looked in at me. He buried his face in his hands. For a moment the only sound was the faint crackle of the fire.
And the stranger? Holmes asked at length. When I turned back, Hatherley said hoarsely, he was gone. He had vanished as silently as he came. The door was still closed. I ran into the passage. No one. Downstairs the porter swore that no gentleman had passed him, yet my visitor had not gone out by the window, for it was shut and latched. Holmes sat back, his face utterly composed. Yet I knew him too well not to detect the quickened interest beneath that calm. And what happened after that? He asked. I did not sleep that night. The next day I went to Aldridge to ask if he had sent anyone. He stared at me as if I were mad. He said he had not spoken my name to any man for a month. He swore he had never heard of any blackmail case. When I returned to my chambers, my clerk told me that 2 men had come in my absence, asking to see me.
Ah, they were rough fellows, workmen perhaps. When he said I was out, they left without a word. Holmes nodded slowly. And then? Then, Hatherley's voice broke. Then this morning I received this. He thrust his hand into his coat and drew out an envelope. It was of thick cream paper, unmarked save for his name, written in a firm, slanting hand. He gave it to Holmes. Holmes did not open it at once. He held it delicately by the corner, sniffed it as though it were a chemical specimen, and examined the seal. An unadorned blob of red wax. London Post, he murmured. Hand-delivered, I suspect. Watson, observe the faint smear at the edge, coal dust or lamp-black. With a penknife, he slit the envelope and drew out a single sheet of paper. Upon it was written in the same firm hand, "You have been observed. You will act when called upon. If you speak of this to any man, the window will speak for you." There was no signature. Holmes handed the note to me. I confess I felt a distinct uneasiness as I read it. The words had in them an insinuation, a threat half suggested rather than stated, which was more chilling than any open menace. "What do you mean by 'the window will speak for you'?" I asked. "I do not know," cried Hatherley. "That is why I am here. I am a solicitor, Mr. Holmes. I have enemies in the ordinary way, disgruntled clients, opposing counsel, but nothing that could lead to this. Someone is playing a game with me, and I am the piece upon their board." Holmes rose and paced once across the room, his hands behind his back, his head sunk upon his chest. When he spoke, it was in that dry, matter-of-fact tone which he assumed when his mind was working at speed. "And how you have told no one else of these occurrences?" "No one, save my clerk, who knows only that strange men called." "And Scotland Yard?" "I dared not. If this is some plot involving a great family, if I am drawn into blackmail, my career is finished. And yet if I do nothing, if I wait, what then?" He looked again toward the window as though expecting it to answer. Holmes stopped pacing and faced him. "You have done wisely to come here," said he. "Now you must do wisely in obeying me. You will return at once to your chambers and go about your affairs as usual. You will show no sign that you are alarmed. You will tell your clerk nothing beyond what he already knows." "But—" Holmes's hand rose, cutting him short. "And you will permit me," he continued, "to visit Gray's Inn this very afternoon. I should like to see this window of yours. Mr. Hatherley stared. You think someone is truly watching me?" Holmes' mouth curled faintly. "My dear sir, someone has been watching you already. The question is, from where, by what means, and for what purpose? Those are matters upon which we shall not speculate until we have facts." His gaze shifted to me. "Watson, your boots," said he. "We may have more Surrey clay before the day is out." Gray's Inn and the watching glass. The fog had thickened by the time we left Baker Street. It lay in low banks along the street, curling about the lamps and muffling the city sounds until even the rumble of wheels seemed far away. Holmes walked with his head slightly forward, like a hound upon a scent, indifferent to the chill and the damp. Mr. Hatherley accompanied us, wrapped tightly in his overcoat, his eyes darting continually from side to side. Gray's Inn, with its old brick buildings and quiet courts, has always struck me as an island of solemnity amid the roar of London. Even on that bleak afternoon there were clerks hurrying under umbrellas and barristers, muffled in scarves, passing with that air of preoccupied importance which the law seems to confer. Mr. Hatherley's chambers were on the second floor of a block which looked across the main courtyard. He unlocked the door and ushered us in. The sitting room was comfortable, with shelves of law books, a writing desk, and a coal fire struggling against the damp. The window in question stood to one side, its curtains drawn back. Holmes went to it at once. It was, as I saw, a large sash window with 12 panes, the glass slightly rippled in the old fashion, and beyond it lay the courtyard, framed by the opposing wings of the inn. The fog blurred the far end into a grey wall. Holmes knelt and examined the sill, running his fingers along the woodwork. Then he rose, opened the window, and leaned out, his long body half disappearing. "Holmes!" I exclaimed, for the drop to the courtyard seemed considerable. He drew back unhurriedly. "Second floor," said he. "Too high for ordinary tapping, unless our visitor is a man of uncommon reach, or unless he did not tap from below." He produced his lens and examined the edges of the frame, the putty, the paint. Mr. Hatherley stood wringing his hands. "What do you see?" he asked. Holmes did not answer at once. He moved to the writing desk and, without apology, lifted a blotter, opened a drawer, and glanced within. "You must forgive my liberties," said he. In my profession, one cannot afford delicacy." "Anything, Mr. Holmes," Hatherley murmured. "Anything." Holmes returned to the window, took from his pocket a small roll of adhesive plaster, and pressed a strip along the bottom edge of the sash, half on the glass and half on the wood. "What is that for?" I asked. "A simple telltale," said he. "If the window is opened, the plaster will tear. If someone tries to remove it, there will be marks. Watson, stand here a moment." He placed me before the window. "Look out," said he. "Do you see anything remarkable?" "Nothing beyond fog and bricks," I replied. "Precisely. Now observe the panes. You will note that one of them is very slightly clearer than the rest." I stared. At first I saw nothing, but as my eyes adjusted I perceived what he meant. How in the upper right pane there was indeed a faint difference, as if it had been cleaned more recently or was of a slightly different glass. "It is newer," I said. "Or it has been handled," Holmes replied. "Finger marks can polish old glass. Now look closely at the putty around that pane." I bent nearer. There, in the grey putty, was a hairline crack. "It has been disturbed," Holmes murmured. "Someone has pried that pane loose and replaced it." Hatherley gave a strangled cry. "My God, why?" Holmes's eyes remained fixed, his face expressionless. "Because," said he quietly, "a window is a useful thing, Mr. Hatherley. It lets in light and it lets out air." His gaze shifted to the courtyard. "And on occasion it can let in an eye." He straightened, dusting his hands. "We have our first solid fact," said he. Now we must ask the next question. Where does that eye go when it is not at your window?" He turned abruptly to the door. "Watson," said he, "we shall take a walk around the courtyard. Mr. Hatherley, you will remain here. If anyone comes, anyone at all, you will observe them, speak little, and remember everything. But," Holmes's voice snapped like a whip, "do as I say." The solicitor, cowed, nodded. Holmes led me down the stairs and out into the damp air of the courtyard. He stood for a moment looking up at the line of windows, his gaze moving from one to another with a precision which I knew meant he was mapping them in his mind. "There," said he suddenly, pointing with his stick. "Where?" "Do you see that narrow passage between the east wing and the wall?" I squinted through the fog. A strip of darkness lay there, scarcely wider than a man. "Someone could stand there unseen," I said. Holmes smiled faintly. "And observe a window which looks upon a window," said he. "The window that watched them all, Watson, the one which sees without being seen." He began walking toward the passage with quick, silent steps. As we approached, a faint sound came to my ears, a scuffing, as of boots upon wet stone. Holmes's hand shot out and gripped my sleeve. "Quiet!" he breathed. From the shadowed passage ahead came a low murmur of voices, and then quite distinctly the sound of something tapping, 3 quick raps like knuckles upon glass. Holmes's eyes gleamed in the fog. "It begins," he whispered, and with that he darted forward into the grey gloom, leaving me to follow with my heart pounding and the sense, stronger than ever, that in London's oldest courts, or mid ancient bricks and modern sin, there are indeed windows which watch. Holmes moved with astonishing swiftness for so tall a man. One moment he was at my side, the next he had slipped into the narrow passage, his figure melting into the fog like a shadow, pursuing another shadow. I followed as best I could, my medical training ill-suited to sudden pursuits over slick stone, yet driven on by that mingled excitement and apprehension which so often attended my friend's investigations. The passage was darker than it had appeared from a distance. The tall walls on either side shut out what little daylight remained, and the fog pressed in, thick and damp, carrying with it the sour scent of old brick and standing water. On ahead of us I could make out the vague outline of a man, no more than a hunched silhouette, who had evidently been engaged in some clandestine activity and was now retreating deeper into the gloom. "Stop!" Holmes called sharply. The figure started, glanced back, and then bolted. What followed was less a chase than a rapid series of deductions in motion. Holmes did not pursue blindly. Instead, he slowed, scanning the ground, the walls, the angles of escape, with that uncanny perception which seemed to render obstacles irrelevant. I, less gifted, slipped once on the wet stones, and would have fallen had Holmes not caught my arm without even turning his head. "He cannot go far," he said calmly. "There are only 2 exits, and one leads directly into the open court." As if summoned by his words, the fugitive emerged suddenly from the passage into the courtyard proper. The fog here thinned just enough for me to see him plainly now, a man of middle height, broad-shouldered, wearing a rough working coat and a soft cap pulled low over his brow. He hesitated, saw that retreat was useless, and then stood his ground with a kind of sullen defiance. Holmes approached him with measured steps. "Good afternoon," said he pleasantly. "You appear to be engaged in a study of architecture." The man spat on the stones. "I've done nothing," he growled. "I'm waiting for a mate." "Indeed? Then perhaps you will explain?" Holmes continued.
Why your knuckles bear fresh traces of red paint, and why there is a corresponding mark upon the window frame of the second floor yonder." The fellow's eyes flicked upward involuntarily, a mistake he seemed to realize too late. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered. Holmes smiled thinly. "You were tapping," said he. "3 raps, a signal no doubt. Your position in that passage allowed you to see Mr. Hatherley's window clearly, while remaining yourself invisible. Ingenious in a clumsy way." The man shifted his weight, clearly considering flight, but Holmes's voice hardened. "Before you decide upon anything foolish," he said, "you should know that Gray's Inn porter has already been alerted, and that any attempt to escape will only worsen your situation."
Now who set you to watch that window?" For a moment I thought the man might refuse to speak. Then his shoulders sagged slightly. "I'm just doing a job," he said. "Watching, tapping, reporting, that's all." "To whom?" Holmes pressed. The man hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know his real name. He calls himself Mr. Crow." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Describe him." "Tall, thin, dresses like a gent, light eyes, never takes his gloves off." I felt a sudden thrill of recognition, and Holmes nodded once, as though a piece had slid neatly into place. "And what were you instructed to report?" he asked. "When the lawyer was alone, when he worked late, when anyone came to see him, and whether he reacted to the tapping." Holmes gave a soft, humourless chuckle. "A human barometer of fear," he murmured. "Very good. You may go." The man stared.
"Ego? Yes. Your usefulness to us ends here. You will not return to this courtyard, and you will not mention this encounter to your employer. If you do, I assure you that Mr. Crow's displeasure will be the least of your worries." Something in Holmes's tone convinced him. Without another word, the fellow turned and hurried away, his boots splashing through the fog until he was swallowed by it. I could not restrain myself. "You let him go?" I exclaimed. Surely he could have been compelled to. No, Holmes interrupted. He knows little and would tell less. More importantly, his disappearance would warn the real mind behind this affair. We must allow our opponent to believe his net remains intact. He turned back toward the passage and studied the walls thoughtfully. The window was altered, he said. The tapping was real but theatrical.
The purpose was not communication, but intimidation. Our Mr. Crow wished Mr. Hatherley to feel observed, powerless, and alone. "And the mysterious visitor to the chambers?" I asked. "The same man," Holmes replied without hesitation. Or rather, the same hand. He needed to introduce the idea of the window before giving it a voice. We returned upstairs, where we found Mr. Hatherley pacing his room in evident distress. He looked up anxiously as we entered. "You heard something?" he asked. "I thought I heard footsteps." "You heard correctly," Holmes said. "You have been watched, as you were told, but you are no longer without allies." He did not yet explain further. Instead, he asked Mr. Hatherley a series of precise questions about his practice, his recent cases, his finances, his personal habits. And at first the solicitor answered nervously, then with growing confidence as he realized that Holmes' inquiries were methodical rather than prying. At length, Holmes stopped. "You have never handled a case involving blackmail," he said, "nor any matter which would justify the secrecy described by your visitor." "Never," Hatherley replied firmly. "Which suggests," Holmes continued, "that you were selected not for what you know, but for what you represent." "And what is that?" I asked. "A respectable intermediary," Holmes replied. "A man whose involvement would lend legal cover to an otherwise criminal enterprise. Someone wishes to use your name, Mr. Hatherley, not your skills." The solicitor sank into a chair. "But for what end?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He went once more to the window and looked out, to his reflection faintly visible in the glass. "There is another window involved," he said at last. "One that sees more than this courtyard. Somewhere nearby is a vantage point, an office, a room, perhaps even an abandoned set of chambers from which observation and access can be combined." "Access?" I echoed. Holmes's gaze flicked to the slightly altered pane. "Yes," said he. "That glass was removed and replaced not merely to allow an eye to look in, but to allow something else to pass through." My heart quickened. "A document?" I suggested. "Perhaps," Holmes said. "Or perhaps something far more valuable, evidence." He turned to Mr. Hatherley. "This evening," said he, "you will dine out and return late. Leave your clerk instructions to admit no one. I shall take up a position nearby with Watson, if our Mr.
Crow believes his pressure is succeeding. He will make his next move soon." "And if he does not?" Hatherley asked. Holmes's lips curved into that dangerous smile I knew so well. "Then," said he, "we shall knock upon his window instead." We did not linger in Mr. Hatherley's chambers. Holmes has ever held that the most dangerous moment in any intrigue is that in which the adversary suspects observation, and he was careful that our departure should appear casual and unremarkable. We left Gray's Inn together, the solicitor hurrying off with anxious glances over his shoulder, while Holmes and I strolled in the opposite direction as though our business there had been of the most ordinary professional kind. The fog had thinned a little with the coming of evening,
resolving itself into drifting veils through which the lamps burned with a dull orange glow. Holmes led me by a circuitous route to a narrow street overlooking the eastern wall of the inn. There he halted before a small tobacconist's shop, its window crowded with pipes and jars of shag. "We shall wait here," said he. "The proprietor is an old acquaintance. He asks no questions and observes everything." From the back room, whose single grimy window commanded a partial view of the upper stories of Gray's Inn, we established ourselves with a pot of strong tea and the pretence of idle conversation. Holmes, however, was anything but idle. He had produced a small notebook and was sketching rapidly, lines, angles, the relative positions of roofs and chimneys, until there grew beneath his pencil a precise map of the surrounding buildings. You see, Watson," he murmured without looking up, "our friend Mr. Crow relies upon perspective. He wishes his victim to believe himself watched from nowhere. To achieve that illusion, the watcher must himself be concealed by structure, not by darkness alone." "And you believe such a place exists?" I asked. Holmes tapped the page. "3 such places," said he. "One is the passage we explored, useful for intimidation, but useless for access. Another is a vacant set of chambers opposite Hatherley's window, long unlet owing to a dispute over repairs. The third is the most interesting of all." He turned the notebook so that I could see. "A narrow attic above the old law stationer's shop," he continued. "Its window aligns almost perfectly with Hatherley's altered pane. From there, one could not only observe, but with minimal risk—"
Manipulate. I was about to ask further when Holmes's hand closed suddenly over my wrist. "Look," he whispered. Across the courtyard, in the growing dusk, a light had appeared in one of the upper windows, Mr. Hatherley's chambers. Almost immediately afterward, another light flickered into being, higher and to the right, faint but unmistakable. Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Our man is punctual," he said. We waited in silence. Minutes passed, 5, perhaps 10, during which nothing stirred. Then faintly I heard it. 3 soft taps carried across the courtyard like the ticking of a clock. Holmes rose at once. "Come," said he. We slipped from the shop and made our way swiftly toward the law stationer's building. The door was closed, but Holmes tried it gently and found it unlocked. "Carelessness," he murmured.
or confidence. We ascended the narrow stairs, our steps muffled by age and dust. At the top, a low door stood ajar, and from within came the sound of breathing, slow, controlled, alert. Holmes did not hesitate. He flung the door wide and stepped inside. The attic was small and bare, save for a chair, a battered table, and a telescope mounted upon a makeshift stand. At the far end, framed by a narrow window, stood a man with his back to us, one gloved hand resting upon the instrument. He turned slowly. It was the man Mr. Hatherley had described, the same tall, spare figure, the same cold, light eyes. His expression did not change as he took in Holmes and myself, though I saw his fingers tighten slightly. "Good evening, Mr. Crow," said Holmes pleasantly. "You have a fine view." The man inclined his head a fraction. "So I see," he replied. His voice was calm, cultured. "I wondered how long it would take you." Holmes's eyebrows lifted. "You expected me?" "I expected someone," Crow said. "Observation invites observers. It is a risk one accepts." Holmes stepped closer, his gaze flicking briefly to the telescope, then back to the man's face. "You altered a window," said he. "You hired a watcher. You frightened a solicitor with theatrical tricks. All this effort suggests something of value, yet you have not yet attempted to take it." Crow smiled faintly. "Pressure takes time," said he. "Men surrender more readily when they believe resistance useless." "And yet," Holmes countered, "you misjudged your man. He sought help." Crow's eyes hardened. "So it seems." For a moment the two men regarded one another in silence, intellect measuring intellect. Then Holmes spoke again. "You wished Mr. Hatherley to act as an intermediary," said he. "You needed his name, his respectability, attached to a transaction of questionable legality, but he has nothing you need. Crow laughed softly. "On the contrary," he said, "he has exactly what I need, access." "To whom?" I asked. Crow glanced at me for the first time, his eyes cool and dismissive. "To a client," he said, "one who believes himself secure behind walls of law and discretion." Holmes's expression sharpened. "A client whose windows are also vulnerable," said he quietly. Crow said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. "You intended," Holmes went on, "to draw Mr. Hatherley into correspondence, to involve him just enough that his professional duty would compel him to receive a document. And once that document passed through his chambers, once it rested, however briefly, within reach of this window, you would obtain it." Crow's smile returned, thinner now. "You give me credit for a cleverness I do not possess," he said. "But even if that were so, you cannot prove it." Holmes nodded. "Not yet," said he, "but you have made one error." "And that is?" "You assumed," Holmes replied, "that the window was the weakest point." With a sudden movement he reached past Crow and swung the telescope aside. Beneath it, on the table, lay a small leather case. Holmes opened it swiftly. Inside were delicate tools, glass cutters, fine wires, suction cups, and wrapped in oilcloth a folded paper. Crow's composure cracked at last. He sprang forward, but Holmes was quicker. He stepped back, holding the paper beyond reach. "Ah," said Holmes, "this is what you truly feared losing." Crow's face was pale now, but his jaw set. "You do not know what you hold," he said. Holmes glanced at the document without unfolding it. "I know enough," said he. "It is not blackmail material, but evidence. Evidence that implicates your employer in a matter he would dearly wish buried. You intended to recover it before it could be delivered to its rightful destination." "To Scotland Yard?" Crow sneered. "No," Holmes replied, "to someone far more dangerous." There was a sudden commotion below, the sound of hurried footsteps and raised voices. Holmes smiled. "Our timing is excellent," said he. "I took the liberty of informing Inspector Lestrade that an unlawful entry might occur this evening." Crow laughed bitterly. "You always did enjoy theatrics, Mr. Holmes." Holmes' eyes were cold. "I enjoy conclusions," said he. As the footsteps reached the stair, Crow straightened, his expression once more composed. "This is not over," he said quietly. "Windows can be replaced." Holmes inclined his head. "Perhaps," said he, "but once one knows where to look, even the best glass becomes transparent." The door burst open and Lestrade appeared, flanked by two constables. At the sight of Crow and the implements upon the table, his face lit with satisfaction. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he said, "what have you found for us this time?" Holmes handed him the leather case. "A man who thought himself unseen," said he, "and a window that betrayed him." Lestrade's arrival, though timely, did not bring with it the sense of finality which usually attends the laying on of official hands. Holmes, I observed, remained alert, his gaze never leaving Crow's face, even as though he regarded the man less as a captured criminal than as a sealed envelope whose contents had yet to be fully examined. Crow submitted to arrest without resistance. He allowed the constables to take his arms, surrendered his gloves at Lestrade's curt command, and even offered a faint smile as he was led past us toward the stairs. "You will find," he said mildly, "that I am far less important than you imagine." Holmes watched him go. "On the contrary," he murmured, "you are precisely as important as I imagine, no more, no less." Lestrade turned, curiosity struggling with his habitual skepticism. "And what's that supposed to mean?" he demanded. "It means," Holmes replied, "that Mr. Crow is a mechanism, not a motive. You may lock him away, but the clock will continue to tick unless we understand what drives it." Lestrade snorted.
Always another layer with you, Holmes. Well, you've got your man and your tools. I'll have this attic searched and the chambers below sealed. By all means, said Holmes, but if you will indulge me, Inspector, I should like a few minutes alone with the contents of that document. Lestrade hesitated, then shrugged. 5 minutes, he said, but no tricks. Holmes inclined his head, and Lestrade withdrew to bark orders at his men. When the door closed behind him, Holmes unfolded the paper at last. I stepped closer, eager to see what prize had been so cunningly pursued. The document was an affidavit written in a firm, educated hand. As Holmes scanned it, I saw his expression change, not to surprise, but to something like grim satisfaction. "This," said he, "explains everything." "What is it?" I asked. "Proof," he replied.
A proof that a certain gentleman of influence falsified records to conceal the death of a young woman some 7 years ago. A death which, had it been properly investigated, would have revealed a chain of corruption extending into several respected institutions. My breath caught. And Mr. Hatherley's role? Entirely incidental, Holmes said. The document was to pass, briefly, through his custody as part of a routine conveyance. Crow's employer learned of this and devised a plan to intercept it without arousing suspicion. A solicitor, frightened into cooperation, is far less conspicuous than one robbed outright. Footsteps sounded again upon the stairs. Holmes folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his pocket. "Come," said he, "we have done all we can here." Outside, the fog had lifted further, revealing a cold, clear night. But Holmes walked swiftly back toward Baker Street, his mind evidently still racing ahead of events. "You mean to confront the employer?" I said. "In due course," Holmes replied. "But first, we must ensure the document reaches its destination." "And that is?" I pressed. Holmes gave me a sidelong glance. "A woman," said he, "one who has waited 7 years for justice." We reached Baker Street shortly before midnight. Holmes lit his pipe and settled into his chair, the document once more in his hands. "There is one final danger," he said. "Crow's arrest will alert his employer. Desperate men are unpredictable." "And Mr. Hatherley?" I asked. "Is he safe?" "For the moment," Holmes said. "But the window has served its purpose. It is time to shift the stage." He wrote a brief note and rang for Mrs. Hudson. "Have this delivered at once," he said, by hand. When she had gone, he turned to me. "Watson," he said, "I require your assistance tomorrow. You will call upon Mr. Hatherley and request in your professional capacity a copy of a deed currently in his keeping. You will say it concerns a patient of yours." "And then?" "And then," Holmes said, "we shall see who attempts to watch which window." Sleep came fitfully that night. My dreams were filled with glass panes and eyes peering through them, with shadows moving silently from room to room. I was up early and at Gray's Inn before the day had fully broken. Mr. Hatherley received me with visible relief. "They came again," he said at once. "2 men, just after dawn. They did not knock. They stood below the window and watched." "And did they tap?" I asked. "No," he said. They only watched." I made my request as Holmes had instructed, and Hatherley produced the deed without comment. As I left the chambers, I glanced back. The window seemed unchanged, innocent in the morning light, yet I could not rid myself of the sense that it was no longer merely an opening, but a participant. Outside, Holmes waited, disguised as a bookseller, his hawk-like gaze following the movements in the courtyard. "Did they watch?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I replied. "Good," said he. "That means the trap is set." We did not have long to wait. Before noon, a carriage drew up at the edge of the inn, and a well-dressed gentleman descended. He did not look up at the windows, he did not hurry. Yet everything about him spoke of control and expectation. Holmes stiffened. "There," he said. That is the man who believed the window would always be on his side." As the gentleman entered the building, Holmes straightened, his face alight with that fierce joy of the chase I knew so well. "Come, Watson," he said, "let us see how he fares when the glass looks back." Holmes did not follow the gentleman at once. He watched instead, his eyes narrowed, as the man crossed the courtyard and disappeared into the stairwell that led toward Mr. Hatherley's chambers. Only when the echo of his footsteps had faded did Holmes move, drawing me with him toward the opposite wing of the inn. "Patience," he murmured. "He believes himself unobserved. We must preserve that illusion for a little longer." We entered the vacant chambers Holmes had earlier identified. They were bare, cold rooms, the plaster cracked, and the floorboards warped with age. But the window was perfectly placed. From it we could see Mr. Hatherley's sitting room clearly, the curtains half drawn, the light within steady and warm against the grey stone. Holmes produced a small pair of field glasses and adjusted them with care. "He has gone in," he said. "Note his manner, Watson. A man who comes to intimidate will hurry. A man who comes to negotiate will linger." Minutes passed. I could see the silhouettes within, Mr. Hatherley rising from his desk, the visitor removing his gloves with deliberate slowness. "Gloves again?" I whispered. "Yes," Holmes replied softly. "Crow learned that habit from his employer." Below, the visitor spoke at length, his gestures smooth, persuasive. Mr. Hatherley's posture was stiff, his movements constrained. Once he shook his head emphatically. The visitor leaned closer. "He is offering terms," Holmes said, likely presenting himself as a rescuer from unnamed dangers. "And Mr. Hatherley?" "He will refuse," Holmes replied. "Fear made him malleable yesterday. Today he has hope." As if in answer, Mr. Hatherley turned abruptly and pointed toward the window, toward us, though of course he could not see us. The visitor froze. Holmes's breath quickened. "He has mentioned the watching," he said. "Now observe." The visitor stepped to the window and peered out. Though his face was too far to read clearly, his body language spoke volumes. He stiffened, then smiled thinly, as though amused by some private joke. "He still believes the advantage is his," Holmes murmured. "That will change." The visitor turned back to Mr. Hatherley and spoke again, more sharply this time. Mr. Hatherley sat. His head bowed for a moment, then rose and walked to his desk. He opened a drawer. Holmes's hand tightened on the glasses. "He expects the document," he said. "But it is not there." Indeed, Mr. Hatherley produced only the deed I had taken earlier and handed it across. The visitor glanced at it, frowned, and said something that caused Mr. Hatherley to spread his hands in helpless explanation. The visitor's composure cracked. He struck the desk with his fist. "Now," said Holmes quietly. "Now he realizes." The gentleman turned once more to the window, his gaze lingering on the courtyard, the opposing wings, the shadows between. "He is calculating," Holmes continued. "He wonders where the document has gone and who else may be watching. We did not keep him long in suspense." Holmes rose and threw open our window. The sound echoed faintly across the courtyard. The visitor started and looked up. For the first time I saw his face clearly, a handsome, commanding face, marred now by a flicker of unease. Holmes leaned forward, resting his hands upon the sill. "Good morning, Sir Reginald," he called, pleasantly. "You are late." The effect was electric. Sir Reginald recoiled as though struck. Mr. Hatherley rushed to the window, his astonishment plain even at that distance. Holmes did not raise his voice. "You have been seeking a document," he continued. "It is no longer in Mr. Hatherley's possession, nor will it ever be again." Sir Reginald's mouth moved, but no sound carried to us. Then he recovered himself, smiled coldly, and bowed. "Mr. Holmes," he called back. "Ever dramatic? I fear you mistake me for someone else." Holmes chuckled.
On the contrary," said he, "I have never been so certain of a man in my life." Sir Reginald stepped back from the window and said something rapid and urgent to Mr. Hatherley. The solicitor shook his head firmly. "That," Holmes said with satisfaction, "is the sound of a door closing." We did not linger further. Holmes closed the window and gestured for me to follow. "He will not attempt flight," he said as we descended the stairs. "Not yet. Men like Sir Reginald believe reputation to be armour. He will seek to control the narrative." "And can he?" I asked. "Only if we allow him time," Holmes replied. Outside, Lestrade awaited us, summoned by Holmes earlier that morning. The inspector listened grimly as Holmes outlined the situation, his scepticism fading with each precise detail. "You can arrest him now," Holmes concluded. Or you can wait and watch him destroy himself. Either course will serve justice, but the latter will reveal his accomplices." Lestrade scratched his chin. "I'll take him in," he said at last. "Big names don't scare me." Holmes's smile was thin. "They should," he said, "but courage becomes you, Inspector." Sir Reginald was arrested within the hour. He offered no resistance, only a tight smile and a promise that his lawyers would have much to say. Holmes merely inclined his head. "Tell them," he said, "to examine the windows." That evening, as we sat once more by the fire in Baker Street, I could not help but reflect upon the curious role that glass and stone had played in the affair. "A window," I said, "seems a frail thing upon which to build such a scheme." Holmes removed his pipe and regarded me thoughtfully. "On the contrary."
"Watson," he said, "a window is a boundary, transparent, deceptive. Men believe themselves safe because they can see out. They forget that others can see in." He rose and drew the curtains against the night. "And sometimes," he added softly, "the most dangerous watcher is the one who waits to be noticed." The arrest of Sir Reginald marked the public end of the affair, but it would be misleading to suppose that matters concluded with the simple closing of handcuffs. Indeed, it was only afterward, when the machinery of justice had begun its deliberate turn, that Holmes saw fit to draw together the many threads which, to my untutored eye, had seemed, at times, hopelessly entangled. It was 2 evenings later, with the November rain beating softly against the windows of Baker Street, that Holmes at last indulged me. He sat in his accustomed chair, long fingers steepled, his expression relaxed, in that peculiar fashion which always followed a successful exertion of his powers. The violin lay untouched upon the table, and the fire burned low. "You look," said I, "as though the matter has finally satisfied you." Holmes smiled faintly. "Satisfaction is too strong a word, Watson. Let us say that the account balances." "Then for heaven's sake," I replied, "allow me to see the arithmetic." He chuckled and leaned back. "Very well, we begin as always with motive. Sir Reginald's fear was not exposure alone, but precedent. 7 years ago, a young woman died under circumstances inconvenient to a powerful circle. Her death was disguised, her records altered, and her name quietly erased. One man, less cautious than the rest, kept proof of the truth." "The affidavit?" I said. "Precisely. When that proof resurfaced, Sir Reginald learned it would pass, quite innocently, through Mr. Hatherley's chambers. A solicitor's office is a place of trust. Documents enter and leave without remark. Theft would raise alarm, coercion could be concealed. And so he chose fear, I said. He chose illusion, Holmes corrected gently. Fear is only effective when its source seems omnipresent. The window served him admirably, transparent, unassuming, yet capable of becoming an eye, a mouth, a threat. He wished Hatherley to believe himself surrounded by unseen watchers until compliance appeared the only rational course. "And Crow?" I asked. "A specialist," Holmes replied. "A man skilled in silence and patience. Sir Reginald employed him to observe, to intimidate, and, should the opportunity arise, to retrieve. But Crow was not subtle enough to hide the traces of his work. Altered glass, predictable signals, hired muscle. He mistook complexity for cleverness." Holmes rose and crossed to the window, drawing the curtain aside a few inches as if to illustrate his point. "The flaw," he continued, "was assuming that observation flows only one way. The moment Sir Reginald relied upon the window, he bound himself to it. Every watcher leaves a footprint, physical or psychological. Mr. Hatherley's terror was as revealing as any fingerprint." "And the document?" I pressed. "You said it was destined for someone more dangerous than the police." Holmes' expression softened slightly. "The woman's sister," he said. "She has spent 7 years assembling fragments of truth. This affidavit completed the picture. It was her determination, not Sir Reginald's guilt,
And that made the outcome inevitable. I was silent for a moment, contemplating the quiet force of that unseen figure. "And Mr. Hatherley?" I asked at last. "He will recover," Holmes said. "Fear passes, reputation endures. He will tell himself that he was merely unlucky to be involved, and that is near enough to the truth." The rain slackened outside, leaving the street washed and gleaming beneath the lamps. Holmes turned back to his chair and settled himself once more. "There is one thing," I said slowly, "that still troubles me. Sir Reginald came himself to the chambers. Surely that was a risk." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Arrogance," said he. "He believed control to be his birthright. Men of that sort trust systems, not people. When the system faltered—"
And he attempted to correct it personally, never suspecting that the very act would expose him. He paused, then added quietly, "It is often the last move which reveals the whole game." A knock came at the door, sharp and familiar. Mrs. Hudson entered with a letter upon a tray. "From Inspector Lestrade, Mr. Holmes." Holmes opened it and scanned the contents. "As expected," he said. "Sir Reginald has named others. The circle widens." "And you?" I asked. "Will you follow it further?" Holmes shook his head. "No," said he. "The work now belongs to others. I have no interest in watching a tide once it has begun to turn." He stood, stretched, and picked up his violin. "The window," he said musingly, "was never the true instrument in this affair. It merely reflected what men chose to place before it. Guilt, fear."
Arrogance. They all show themselves if one looks long enough." He raised the violin to his chin and drew out a slow, contemplative air, rich and melancholy. As the music filled the room, I felt once more that familiar blend of admiration and humility which Holmes's successes invariably inspired in me. Later, as I prepared these notes for publication, I found myself pausing by my own window, gazing out at the quiet street below. Curtains were drawn, lamps extinguished, lives unfolding unseen behind glass and brick. It is a comforting illusion, I reflected, to believe that our walls protect us absolutely, that we may look out without ever being observed. Holmes, I know, would have smiled at the thought. For in a city like London, with its 1,000 windows and its million secrets, there is always something watching, and it is not always the glass we should fear, but what it reflects back at us when the light changes.